The lantern had not been lit in 2 years, and every soul in Millhaven, Texas, knew exactly why. Lewis Rhodes stood at the edge of his porch in the amber dusk of an October evening in 1882, staring out at the rolling stretch of land that had once been his everything and now felt like a wound that refused to close. The main house lantern hung beside the front door, its glass clouded with dust and disuse, its wick dry and forgotten. He had hung it there himself on the day he brought his wife home, Caroline, with her dark hair and her easy laugh, and the light it threw had seemed to him then like a promise made to the whole wide world. When Caroline died of the fever that swept through Millhaven in the autumn of 1880, taking 3 children and 2 old men along with her, Lewis had let the lantern go dark. He had not touched it since. He was not sure he ever intended to. He was 31 years old and already carrying the kind of quiet that settles into men twice his age. He ran the Rhodes cattle operation mostly alone now, with the help of his 2 ranch hands, Decker and old Hob, who had been with the family since before Lewis was born. The ranch was profitable enough, the cattle fat on good grass, the fences holding. From the outside, a man could look at the Rhodes spread and call it a success. From the inside, Lewis knew it was simply a thing that continued because he did not know how to stop it. He rose before dawn, worked until his body ached, ate whatever Hob left warming on the stove, and went to bed in a house that felt 3 sizes too large for one man. The town of Millhaven was small but lively in the way most Texas frontier towns were in that era, perched between possibility and danger. The cattle trade had brought money, and money had brought a proper general store, a physician's office, a church with a bell that could be heard half a mile out, and a post office that doubled as a telegraph station when the line was working. Sheriff Emmett Prout kept reasonable order, though the Panhandle country had a way of producing trouble faster than one man could manage. Lewis was known and respected there. People were kind to him. They had stopped looking at him with pity somewhere around the 1-year mark, which he appreciated deeply, though the older women still sometimes brought him pies, which he also appreciated, for entirely different reasons. It was Decker who told him about the notice. Decker was 26, lean as a fence rail, with sun-darkened skin and a habit of appearing at Lewis's elbow whenever something needed to be said that Lewis would rather not hear. He had come into the barn one morning in late September of 1882 holding a folded sheet of paper the way a man holds something he is not entirely sure will be welcomed. "Hob put this into me to give to you," Decker said. He saw it posted over at the general store. Lewis was brushing down his roan gelding cutter, and he did not look up. "What is it?" "It's a letter of introduction posted on the board. Woman by the name of Bristol, Belle Bristol. She is looking for land work of the kind that would let her use her skills with record-keeping and household management. She was a school teacher in Galveston until the school was closed down. She has come inland looking for work, has references from 2 families she assisted in San Antonio. She is currently staying at the boarding house in town." Lewis went on brushing. Cutter flicked an ear. "What does that have to do with me?" Lewis asked. "Hob says the household side of this ranch is suffering, and he is not wrong, Lewis. The books are 6 weeks behind. The supply inventory has not been properly done since spring. The pantry situation is something I would rather not describe out loud." Lewis turned then and looked at Decker with the flat expression he reserved for conversations he did not intend to lose. "Tell Hob to mind the cattle and not my kitchen." Decker placed the folded paper on the top rail of the stall and walked away without another word. Lewis left the paper there for 3 days. On the 4th day it rained, and he picked it up before it got wet, and he unfolded it in the barn's gray light. The handwriting was clean and small, the letters precise the way a schoolteacher's letters tend to be. The notice introduced one Miss Belle Bristol, age 27, formerly of Galveston and most recently of San Antonio, who offered services in household management, record-keeping, bookkeeping, and the education of children where applicable. It said she was in good health and had strong references. It said she could be contacted at the Millhaven boarding house in care of Mrs. Aldrich. Lewis read it twice, folded it again, and put it in his shirt pocket. He went back to work. He did not go to town that day or the next, but he found himself reading it again at the supper table that night, and he could not have explained to anyone, including himself, why the handwriting seemed to him like something he wanted to keep looking at. It was Hob who finally settled the matter, as Hob tended to settle most matters on the Rhodes ranch. He was 63 years old, built like a man who had spent his entire life doing exactly what needed to be done without complaint, and he had been cooking and keeping the bunkhouse accounts for Lewis's father before Lewis was born. He did not often speak directly about personal things, but when he did, he had a way of making it sound like a fact of nature rather than an opinion. He came in from the back pasture one afternoon and set his hat on the table and looked at Lewis with the straightforward gaze of a man who has decided to say something. "The books need doing," Hob said. "My eyes are getting worse in the evening light and I make errors. The supply list for winter needs to be done right or we will run short. You know this." "I can do the books myself," Lewis said. "You haven't done them in 6 weeks," Hob said, "and before that they were 3 weeks behind. Lewis, this is not about the books." Lewis looked at him. "This is about you keeping the world at arm's length and calling it managing," Hob said, and then he put his hat back on and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Lewis alone with the cold stove and the echo of something true. Lewis went to town the next morning. Millhaven's Main Street was the particular kind of busy that a cattle town generates on a Tuesday, which is to say there were horses at the hitching rails and men moving between the blacksmith and the feed store and women with baskets heading in and out of the general store. The boarding house sat at the quieter end of the street, a wide 2-story frame building with a covered porch and flower boxes that still held the dried remains of summer. Mrs. Aldrich ran it with the efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped finding anyone surprising. Lewis tied Cutter to the rail and went up the steps and knocked. Mrs. Aldrich answered, took one look at him and said, "She is in the sitting room, Mr. Rhodes. I will let her know you are here." He waited on the porch, hat in his hands, which was not a position he was accustomed to occupying. He was a man who was comfortable on horseback, comfortable with a rope or a branding iron, comfortable in the open country where things were direct. Standing on a porch holding his hat was a different kind of work. She came to the door, and his first impression was not what he had expected. He had formed some vague picture in his mind of a schoolteacher from Galveston, something thin and spectacled and prone to correcting his grammar, and instead what came through the door was a woman who looked like she had been made specifically for a life that was harder and more beautiful than most people got to live. She was 27. Though she looked both younger and older than that at the same time, the way people do when they have seen some things, and not let those things hollow them out. She had dark honey-colored hair pinned back with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who did not have time to fuss, and brown eyes that were warm and direct in equal measure. She was wearing a simple calico dress, dark blue, and she stood with the posture of someone who was used to standing before rooms full of people and holding their attention. "Mr. Rhodes," she said. It was not a question. "Miss Bristol," he said, "I received your notice." "Several people have," she said, stepping out onto the porch. "Please sit if you like." She gestured to the 2 rocking chairs that flanked the door and took one herself with the natural ease of someone who was perfectly comfortable being looked at and did not need to make a performance of it. Lewis sat. He put his hat on his knee. "I run the Rhodes cattle operation about 4 miles south of town," he said. "I have 2 hands and a man who has been with the family long enough that I do not technically employ him so much as he allows me to use his expertise. The household side of things has been managed poorly. The books are behind, the supply inventory is overdue, and I am told the pantry situation is something that should not be described out loud." Something happened in her face that was not quite a smile but was very close to it. "Who told you that last part?" "One of my hands." That is specific criticism, she said. Decker is a specific man. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes for a moment. What would the arrangement be? A room in the main house which has 2 unused bedrooms. Meals from the kitchen which is better equipped than the current cooking situation would suggest. A fair wage, which I will let you tell me what fair is since I have no particular reference point. You would manage the household accounts, maintain the supply inventory, and bring the record books current. If there is anything else that wants doing and is within reason, we can discuss it. She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the porch boards in thin lines. I want to be clear about something, she said, and her voice was steady in a way that told him this was not the first time she had needed to be clear about this particular thing. I am seeking employment. I am good at what I do. I am not looking for anything else at this moment, and I would want that understood from the start. That is understood, Lewis said. He meant it, and something in his tone must have carried that because she nodded once as if a transaction had been agreed upon. When would you want me to start? She asked. As soon as suits you, he said. I would send Decker in with the wagon. Tomorrow morning would suit me, she said. I have little enough to pack. He stood and put his hat on, and they shook hands in the manner of a business arrangement. And Lewis walked back down the steps to Cutter, feeling oddly like something in the world had shifted slightly on its axis, though he could not have said in which direction. The following morning was clear and cold, the kind of October morning in the Texas Panhandle that smells like frost and dry grass and something approaching the edge of winter. Decker drove the wagon into town and came back with Belle Bristol sitting on the bench beside him, a trunk and 2 smaller cases loaded in the back, and a general demeanor that suggested she had already asked Decker several practical questions about the ranch and received satisfactory answers. Lewis watched them come down the road from the porch, and then he went back inside because he did not want to look like a man standing on his porch watching someone arrive. Hobbs showed her the main house, which Lewis had had Decker clean to within an inch of its life the evening before, and the bedroom she was to use, which was at the far end of the upper hall and had a good east-facing window. She set her things inside without ceremony, came downstairs, located the books in the study, and by midday was sitting at the desk with the record books open in front of her and a look on her face that said she had seen worse, but was not pleased with what she was seeing. Lewis came in from the north pasture at noon and found Hobb at the kitchen stove and Belle at the study desk, and the house felt different in a way he could not name and chose not to examine. There are 3 separate ledger systems in here that contradict each other, Belle said without looking up. I started a new one when the first got full, Lewis said, and then another when the second got full. That seemed logical at the time. She looked up at him then, and there was that almost smile again. I will need 2 days to reconcile them. After that, I can maintain a single system going forward. 2 days is fine, he said. She went back to the ledgers. He went to the kitchen for the midday meal. Hobb had made a beef stew that was considerably better than anything the kitchen had produced in recent memory, which Lewis attributed to the presence of a witness. That afternoon, Lewis rode the south fence line with Decker and mended 2 sections where the wire had gone slack. The cattle were in good condition, the water in the stock tank was holding, and the weather looked favorable for another few weeks before the real cold came in. Everything on the land side of the operation was as it should be. He told himself that was the only side that mattered and almost believed it. At supper, Belle joined them at the kitchen table. This was new. Lewis had eaten most meals alone for 2 years, and Decker and Hobb generally ate in the bunkhouse or outside if the weather allowed. He had not thought about what the meal arrangement would look like with someone else living in the house, and neither apparently had anyone else, so they all arrived at the kitchen at the same time and sat down with the slight awkwardness of people figuring out a new geography. Hobb served the supper and then sat himself, as was his custom when Lewis insisted. Decker had washed his face and hands, which was also new. The supply list wants attention before the end of the month, Belle said, passing the biscuits. I have started a rough inventory from what I could see in the pantry and the storeroom. We are low on salt pork, lamp oil, and several other basics. I will have a full list by tomorrow. I usually go to town on Saturdays, Lewis said. Saturday would be fine. I can make the list detailed enough that anyone could fill it. Decker ate without speaking, which was unusual for him. Lewis noticed that Decker was sitting with his spine unusually straight, which was even more unusual. Where were you teaching before Galveston? Hob asked Belle, with the directness of a man who had no patience for conversational circling. I grew up in Houston, Belle said. I taught there first, then moved to Galveston when the school there offered a better position. I taught 3rd and 4th grade readers for 4 years before the school lost its funding and was consolidated with the church school, which already had a teacher. That is a hard thing, Hobbs said. It was, she said, but it is not the worst thing that has happened. I adapted. She said this without self-pity, in the tone of a woman who has had to adapt more than once and has made peace with being the kind of person who can. Lewis looked at her sideways. She was eating her supper with the clean economy of someone who does not waste motion on unnecessary things. And there was something about that he found himself noticing without meaning to. The Rhodes Ranch has been doing well, Decker offered, as if trying to contribute something impressive to the record. I can see that from the ledgers, Belle said. The cattle operation is solid. The household accounts have been neglected, but the underlying numbers are sound. You run a profitable spread, Mr. Rhodes. Lewis, he said, and then was slightly surprised he had said it. She looked at him. Lewis, she said, and went back to her supper. The first 2 weeks passed in the way that new arrangements do when they are working, but nobody wants to say so out loud for fear of jinxing it. Belle brought the ledgers current and constructed a single clean system that Lewis could follow without difficulty. She completed the supply inventory, drew up the winter provision list, and organized the storeroom so that things could be found without a lantern held at arm's length. She found the payroll records from the previous year and identified 2 discrepancies that turned out to be in Lewis's favor when she corrected them. She did all of this with a quiet competence that Lewis found both useful and, he slowly admitted to himself, impressive in a way that went beyond the practical. He began to notice other things. The way she walked across the yard in the early morning, a shawl around her shoulders, carrying coffee to the porch. The way she looked at the land, not with the wariness of someone in unfamiliar country, but with genuine attention, as if she was reading it. The way she talked to Hob in the evenings, drawing out stories about the early days of the ranch and the history of the Texas grassland with the natural curiosity of a former teacher who is still interested in everything. He did not examine these things closely. He was not ready to examine them closely. Belle, for her part, had come to the Rhodes Ranch with her eyes open and her expectations controlled. She had been in Galveston when the fever hit in 1878 and had watched 2 of her teaching colleagues die of it, and she had come out of that experience with a practical philosophy about the nature of loss and the continuing obligation to live. She had come to Millhaven because the opportunities were running thin in the big cities for a woman without family money, and because she had always suspected she was built for a larger kind of life than the one a city schoolroom provided. She had not expected the ranch to be beautiful, and it was. Not in a gentle way, not in the way that paintings in city parlors suggested the frontier looked, but beautiful in the real way, the way of a thing that does not care whether you notice it. The sky over the Panhandle in October was a color she could not have described to anyone who had not seen it, a blue so deep and vast it made you feel simultaneously very small and very alive. The grass rolled in the wind off the plains in long silver waves. The cattle moved through it in slow, dark shapes, and the horses moved differently, with purpose and precision, and the whole thing had a rhythm that she found herself tuning into without meaning to. She noticed Lewis in the way you notice a landscape you have decided not to paint, carefully, from a distance, with the awareness that getting closer might complicate things. He was a quiet man, but not an empty quiet. She had met empty quiet men before, men who had nothing to say and were satisfied with that. Lewis's quiet was the kind that comes from having a great deal inside and having decided not to hand it out freely. He was careful with words, not stingy, and when he said something he meant it exactly, which was a quality she valued above almost anything else in people. She had been told by Mrs. Aldrich, before she came out to the ranch, that Lewis Rhodes had lost his wife 2 years prior, that he had been close to inconsolable in the first year, and had in the second year hardened into a kind of steady endurance that people found both admirable and sad. Mrs. Aldrich had told her this not as gossip, but as context, the way a careful person prepares you for weather before you step outside. Belle understood grief. She did not make the mistake of trying to address it directly. She was simply present, doing the work she had been hired to do, and if her presence seemed to change the texture of the air in the house in ways that were not her responsibility to notice, then that was a thing she kept quietly to herself. The first time something shifted between them was over a horse. One morning in the 3rd week, Lewis came up from the barn in a state of controlled worry, which on him looked like a deeper than usual stillness. His best breeding mare, a gray called Silver Lady, had cut her left foreleg on a piece of broken fence rail, and the cut was deep enough to require stitching and careful management. The animal was valuable, both monetarily and to Lewis personally, as she had been the last horse his father had chosen before the elder Rhodes died. Lewis had the wound cleaned and wrapped, and Silver Lady settled in the stall with extra hay when Belle appeared at the barn door in her work dress and boots, having seen him moving quickly from the house and followed with the instinct of someone who finds it easier to help than to wait. "What happened?" she said. He told her. She came into the stall without hesitation, which was its own kind of thing, because not everyone was comfortable in a stall with a nervous, injured horse. Silver Lady was restless, pulling at the lead, and Belle put her hand on the mare's neck and spoke to her in a low, steady voice, not quite words, just sound, and the horse stilled. Lewis watched this happen and felt something move in his chest that he could not immediately account for. "She will be all right," Belle said, not a question. "If she does not re-injure it in the next week," Lewis said. "She needs to stay off it." "Keeping a horse still is hard work," Belle said. "Everything worth having requires hard work," Lewis said, and then he heard himself say it and felt the double weight of it and looked away. Belle was quiet for a moment, still stroking the mare's neck. "That is a true thing," she said simply, and did not make anything more of it. They stood there together in the barn with the injured horse between them for a few minutes more, and neither of them said anything, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that you can only have with someone when you have already decided, at some level below deliberate thought, that their company is welcome. Lewis spent the next several evenings in the barn with Silver Lady, monitoring the wound and keeping the animal calm. On the 3rd evening, Belle brought a lantern and a cup of coffee and sat on the hay bale outside the stall while he changed the dressing, and she read to him from a worn copy of David Copperfield she had brought from her trunk, in a voice that was low and even and perfectly suited to the quiet of the barn. He did not tell her to stop. He sat on the stall floor with his back against the boards and listened to the story and the wind outside and Silver Lady's breathing, and felt something he had not felt in 2 years, which was the sense of an evening being something more than just the hours before sleep. He did not identify it yet. He was not ready. The first real conversation they had about something that was not ranch business happened on a Saturday afternoon in early November when Lewis returned from town with the supply wagon and found Belle on the back porch shelling dried corn into a clay pot. She had pulled her hair back loose, the way she wore it when she was not going to town, and the afternoon light made the honey in it visible. He sat on the porch steps and began going through the supply list to make sure everything had been filled. "Did you find the lamp oil?" she asked, without looking up from the corn. 2 gallons, he said, "and salt and the flour and everything on the list, except the nutmeg. Caldwell at the general store says he is waiting on a delivery from San Antonio. Nutmeg is not urgent," she said. "It was for the Christmas cake." He looked at her. "Christmas cake? I make one every year, she said, still shelling. Hob mentioned he had not had a proper Christmas dinner in some time. I thought it might be a thing worth doing. Lewis looked back at the supply list. Something about this simple statement, the idea of a Christmas dinner being a thing worth doing, hit him somewhere soft and unexpected. He had let Christmas pass unremarked the last 2 years, not from cruelty or deliberate decision, but because the house had felt too large and too quiet to fill with occasion. There used to be, he said, and then stopped. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were direct and gentle in the same measure. There used to be a proper Christmas here, he said, finishing the sentence. Before. I know, she said quietly. Mrs. Aldrich told me about your wife. I am sorry, Lewis. He nodded once, the way he always received condolences, with the particular economy of a man who has heard them many times and still finds them both inadequate and necessary. Caroline was a good woman, he said. It was the first time he had said her name out loud to anyone in months. She would have made this ranch into something remarkable. She had plans for it. What kind of plans? Belle asked, and she asked it without the careful hesitation that most people brought to the subject, as if his wife's name were fragile glass that might shatter if handled incorrectly. Something about the directness of it made him answer directly. She wanted to expand the house, not grandly but practically. She talked about a proper library because she read everything she could get her hands on. She wanted a garden, the kind that produces not just flowers but things you can actually use. She had a list of improvements she kept in her head, and she would go through them sometimes at night, just talking quietly in the dark, planning. Belle listened to this with the full attention that a good teacher brings to a student who is finally saying the important thing. She sounds like she would have done all of it, Belle said. She would have, Lewis said. She was that kind of person. He looked out at the ranch yard where the late afternoon light was going golden over the grass, and he felt the grief settle back into its familiar place inside him, no longer a raw edge but something weathered and present, like an old scar that aches in certain weather. I am sorry, he said. I do not usually talk about this. You do not have to stop, she said, or continue. Either way is fine. He looked at her. She had gone back to the corn, giving him the choice without pressure, and he found that the choice felt easier than it usually did. Do you want to know something strange? He said. Yes, she said without hesitation. I have not lit the main lantern, the one by the front door, since she died. I cannot entirely explain why. It is not rational. She was quiet for a moment, turning a dry ear of corn in her hands. It does not need to be rational, she said. Some things are just how they are. Everyone in town knows about it, he said. I am aware of that. It has become something people remark on. Let them, she said simply. It is your lantern. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone recognizing an unexpected quality in another person. She said it without performance, without the delicacy of someone managing a difficult man, and without the brisk cheerfulness that some people brought to his grief like a tool meant to fix something. She said it like a fact. It is, he said. They sat on the porch until the light changed and Hob called them in for supper, and the conversation moved to other things, but Lewis carried the feeling of it through the meal and into the evening, and it was still there when he went to bed. November deepened into the cold, and the work of the ranch shifted into its winter patterns. The cattle were moved to the southern pastures where the grass held longer, and the preparations for the hard months were methodically completed under the combined management of Lewis and Belle, who had developed a working rhythm that was as natural as any partnership Lewis had experienced. She kept the records, managed the house, and had taken on the task of corresponding with the cattle buyers in Abilene and San Antonio who were Lewis's primary market, which freed him for the land work and produced, as a side effect, more organized and legible correspondence than Lewis had ever sent in his life. She also, without making an announcement of it, began teaching Decker to read. Lewis discovered this one evening when he came back from the barn and heard voices in the kitchen, and found Belle at the table with a primer and Decker sitting across from her working his way through a sentence with the intense concentration of a man who has never done anything by half measures. Lewis stood in the doorway for a moment, not wanting to interrupt. Decker looked up, saw him, and looked neither embarrassed nor defiant. "Miss Bristol offered," he said. "I can do numbers, but the letters have always been a difficulty." "It is a fine thing to learn," Lewis said, and went back out to the porch so they could continue. He sat in the cold for a while and watched the dark sky over the Panhandle, which was enormous and full of stars, the way only a sky far from city light can be. And he thought about the fact that his house had become a place where things happened, where things were made and learned and kept, and that this had not been true for 2 years, and that it felt, carefully, like something returning from a long way away. It was in the second week of November that Millhaven generated some actual trouble, which was not unusual for a cattle town on the Texas frontier in 1882. A man by the name of Crenshaw had been moving along the range south of Millhaven for several weeks, and there were reports from 2 neighboring ranches of missing cattle. Nothing proven, nothing that Sheriff Prout could act on with his limited resources, but the talk in town was serious, and the neighboring ranchers were meeting and keeping their hands armed and their fences watched. Lewis had heard the reports and had Decker double-checking the cattle counts and riding the boundary fence lines. He did not tell Belle about it, not because he was keeping things from her, but because it seemed like a separate category of problem, the land and cattle side of things, which he managed in the way he had always managed it. She found out anyway. She had been in town picking up the nutmeg that had finally arrived, riding in with Hob, and had heard enough conversation at the general store to put together the shape of the situation. She came home and set the nutmeg on the kitchen shelf and came to find Lewis in the study where he was going over the recent cattle count. "This Crenshaw business," she said, sitting down across the desk. "How serious is it?" He told her what he knew. She listened without interruption, and when he finished she said, "What does the fence situation look like on the south boundary?" "Decker has been over it twice in the last week," Lewis said. "It is holding, but it is a long line and one man cannot watch all of it. Could you put Hob on the south end in the mornings and Decker on the north end?" "Hob's leg has been bothering him," Lewis said. "I do not want to put him on extended fence riding." She thought about this. Could Hob manage the south end from the wagon, driving it slow along the fence line? Less riding, but he would still cover the ground. Lewis looked at her. It was a practical, specific, entirely workable idea that had not occurred to him. "That would work," he said. "I will take over whatever Hob was doing in the mornings here to free him up," she said, "if you can tell me what needs doing." "You do not have to take on more work," he said. "I do not mind more work," she said, and the simplicity of it was characteristic. "I would mind considerably more if something happened to your cattle because the fence was undermanned." He looked at her across the desk, the lamp burning between them, and felt the odd sensation of being genuinely taken care of by another person, which was something he had not experienced in such a long time that it registered as nearly foreign. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, as if the matter were settled, and went back to the kitchen. The arrangement worked. Hob drove the south fence line each morning from the wagon and reported back each evening. Decker covered the north and east sides on horseback. Lewis covered the west boundary himself and spent an extra hour each evening checking the main herd. The cattle count held steady. Crenshaw, if he had been considering the Rhodes ranch as a target, apparently reconsidered, because the trouble came down at the Hensley spread 2 miles east instead, and Sheriff Prout was finally able to make a case and run the man out of the county. The crisis passed, as crises in the Panhandle tended to do, replaced immediately by new practical concerns and the ongoing work of keeping a cattle operation running in November. Lewis noticed in the days after that he had not once felt alone in managing it, that he had, in fact, operated during the whole affair as half of a 2-person decision-making unit without consciously choosing to do so, and that the decisions had been better for it. He sat with this for several days without knowing what to do with it. Belle, meanwhile, had discovered Caroline's garden. It was not much to look at in November, just a rectangular patch of earth on the south side of the house, enclosed by a low rail fence that Lewis had built years ago. The earth was overgrown with dead weeds and dried grass, and the fence needed repair in 3 places, and nothing had been planted there in 2 years. But the soil, when Belle turned it with the edge of her boot, was dark and rich, and the enclosed position would catch the winter sun and hold warmth in a way that would make spring planting possible earlier than an exposed plot. She did not do anything with it yet. It was November and the ground was hardening toward winter, and it was not the time for planting. But she noticed it, and she thought about it, and she found herself, on quiet evenings, standing at the kitchen window that looked out over it and imagining what it could be. She did not tell Lewis about this. The garden had been Caroline's plan, and she understood without being told that it was a complicated piece of ground. December arrived with a north wind that swept down from the plains without apology and set the temperature dropping fast. Hob began making heavier soups. Belle found 3 wool blankets in a cedar chest in the upstairs hall and distributed them to the bunkhouse without ceremony. The cattle were in the southern pastures and the winter feeding had begun, and the days shortened, and the ranch settled into the quieter tempo of the cold months. The Christmas preparations began, because Belle had made them a thing that was happening whether anyone had formally agreed to them or not. She made the Christmas cake when the nutmeg arrived, a dense dark thing full of dried fruit and spice that she wrapped in cloth and set in the coolest corner of the storeroom to age. She began making small preparations that Lewis found in corners of the house, sprigs of cedar on the windowsills, a new tablecloth for the kitchen table, a careful mending of the dining room chairs that had been sitting unused since before Lewis could remember needing them. He watched all of this happen and did not know what to feel about it. Not discomfort, exactly. Something more like standing at the edge of something he had told himself he would not approach again, and feeling his feet moving toward it anyway without his full permission. One evening in mid-December, he found her at the kitchen table with a piece of plain cloth and a needle and thread, doing something careful and slow, and he came and looked over her shoulder, and she was embroidering the tablecloth, tiny flowers in a pattern around the edge. "My mother taught me," she said, not looking up. "It is very fine work," he said, meaning it. "Sit down," she said. "You have been standing in doorways watching me work for 3 weeks, and it is time you sat down." He sat down. The lamp on the table threw warm yellow light over the cloth in her hands and the slight curl of hair that had escaped its pin beside her left ear. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "Why did you come here?" he said. "Not to Millhaven, I mean, to this ranch specifically. You had the notice posted and you could have taken a position anywhere. Caldwell at the general store has 3 children and his wife has been unwell. The Hensley family has been looking for someone to help with their household since their daughter married. Why here?" She was quiet for a moment, her needle moving through the cloth. "Because when I read your letter," she said slowly, "the one you sent to Mrs. Aldrich when you came to inquire, it was the most honest letter I had ever read from a potential employer. Most people write letters of inquiry that are about themselves. Yours was about the work that needed doing and what the conditions were. You described the house and the ranch and the state of the books, and you described Hob, and you said at the end that you were looking for someone competent and you did not want to waste their time or yours by misrepresenting the situation." She looked up at him then. "I appreciated the honesty," she said. "I have had enough of people who manage the truth to their advantage." He held her gaze. "What happened?" he asked. "Who managed the truth at your expense?" She looked back at her embroidery. "There was a man in Galveston," she said, "after the school closed. He told me he was unattached and had plans and a future, and I believed him longer than I should have, and he was not unattached and his plans did not include me in the way he had implied. I came out of it without being destroyed, but I came out of it with a very clear preference for honest people." "I am sorry," Lewis said. "That is a bad thing to have done to you." "It was," she said simply, "but it is done now." He thought about this, about the kind of hurt that comes from being lied to by someone who should have told the truth, and about the parallels to his own experience of loss, which was a different kind of wound, but made in the same general territory of trusting someone completely. "I am honest," he said. "I am not always good at saying things, but I do not say things that are not true." She looked at him, and her face held something open and careful at the same time. "I know," she said. "I have learned that about you." They sat in the kitchen for another hour, her embroidering and Lewis pretending to look at the week's feed records, and actually spending most of the time in a pleasant low-level awareness of the lamp and the fire, and the sound of the needle through the cloth. And when they finally said good night, it was with the slightly charged awkwardness of people who are starting to know something they have not yet said out loud. Lewis went upstairs to bed and lay there for a long time looking at the ceiling. He was falling in love with her. He knew it now with the same clear, inescapable certainty with which he knew when a storm was coming or a fence was failing. It was not a comfortable knowledge, and it was not an unwelcome one. It was simply true, the way true things are, whether you are ready for them or not. He did not know what to do with it. He was not sure he had the right to it. He had loved Caroline completely, and she had been gone 2 years, and he still carried her with him as a permanent fact of himself, and he did not know how to reconcile those two true things into a single life. He lay there in the dark and did not resolve it, and eventually fell asleep. Christmas came on a Sunday that year, and Belle had indeed made it a thing worth having. She had, over the previous weeks, organized a Christmas dinner that was the finest meal the Rhodes Ranch kitchen had produced in longer than Hob could recall, which was saying something. There was a roasted haunch of beef and sweet potatoes and dried apple pie, and the Christmas cake that had been aging in the storeroom since November, which when sliced turned out to be the kind of cake that makes even taciturn men say things they might not otherwise. Decker said it was the best thing he had ever eaten in his life, which made Belle laugh, the first full laugh Lewis had heard from her, a real one that lit her whole face, and the sound of it caught him somewhere under his sternum and stayed. Hob had found, from somewhere in the depths of his bunkhouse belongings, a harmonica, and after supper he played it in the kitchen while the wind came down off the plains and the lamp burned steady and warm. Decker knew 2 songs and sang them both, badly, and Belle knew the words to the second one and joined in, and Lewis sat at the kitchen table watching all of it and feeling the peculiar full ache of happiness mixed with loss, which is what Christmas tends to produce in people who have known grief. After Decker and Hob had gone out to the bunkhouse, Lewis and Belle sat by the kitchen stove for a while, the way they had been doing more evenings than not, and it was quiet and it was easy and it was exactly the kind of quiet he had not had in 2 years. "Thank you," he said, "for all of this." "It was a pleasure," she said. "I meant that. I have not had a real Christmas in several years either." He looked at her. "Since Galveston." "Since before Galveston," she said. "My parents died when I was 22. I have been on my own since then. Christmas has been something I observe, but not something I have celebrated, not really, not with people." He had not known about her parents, and the knowledge of it settled into his understanding of her and made several things make more sense. The competence that was not hardness, the self-sufficiency that was not coldness, the way she looked at the land with such careful attention, as if she was learning it the way a person learns something they intend to keep. "You have been alone a long time," he said. "So have you," she said. They looked at each other, and the acknowledgement of that shared fact hung in the kitchen air between them, simple and significant. "Belle," he said, and his voice was lower and more deliberate than usual. "Lewis," she said, and there was a question in it and an answer at the same time. "I find myself in a situation I was not expecting," he said, "and I am not certain how to handle it rightly." She was looking at him with those direct brown eyes that never asked him to be anything other than exactly what he was. "I have tried to be honest with you about this house and what it holds," he said, "and what it held before. I am not a man who has moved past his losses, and I do not intend to pretend otherwise. But I am also—" He stopped. He was not good at this. He had always been better with action than with words of this particular kind. "You are also something more than a man defined only by his losses," she said quietly. "Yes," he said, with the relief of being understood. "I do not want to offer you something less than the truth of what this situation is. I am a man with a ranch and a grief and a household that needed attention, and you came and gave it attention, and somewhere in that I have—" He stopped again. "Lewis," she said, "I know what you are trying to say. I have known for some weeks. And I want to say back to you that I did not come here with any expectation of this, and that I have been careful with myself because I have been careful with myself before and still ended up hurt, and I am not interested in being hurt again." "I do not intend to hurt you," he said. "I believe that," she said, "and I also know that no one intends to. So what I need from you, if this is a conversation we are actually having, is the truth of where you are, not where you think you should be. Where you actually are." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table, and then he looked up at her. "I have been alone in this house for 2 years," he said. "I have kept the lantern dark, and I have managed the ranch, and I have told myself that was enough. And then you came, and the house started to feel like a house again, and the evenings started to feel like evenings, and I started to feel like myself again in ways I had stopped expecting to. That is where I am." She held his gaze for a long time. "That is where I am too," she said quietly. "Not the same way with different history, but the same direction." He exhaled, slow and steady, as if something he had been holding for a long time had finally been set down. "I am not asking you for anything tonight," he said, "except for you to know that." "I do know it," she said. "And you should know that I came to this ranch for a position, and found something I was not looking for, and I am still deciding what to do about that. But I am not unhappy about it." They said goodnight with a new weight of understanding between them, and Lewis went upstairs to bed feeling, for the first time in 2 years, like the house he was living in was fully inhabited. January came in hard and cold, the way January in the Texas Panhandle comes in when it is serious about winter, and the work of the ranch contracted around the essential tasks of keeping the cattle alive and the humans warm. The days were short and bright and bitter, and the evenings were long, and the household settled into a winter intimacy that was different from anything that had preceded it. Lewis and Belle talked in the evenings without pretending they were not. About the ranch and its future, about the history of the Panhandle country, about books, about the nature of Texas politics, about the cattle trade and the complicated business of water rights that was becoming the defining issue of the region as more settlers moved in, and the land got carved into competing claims. Belle had opinions about all of it that were sharp and well considered, and Lewis found himself reconsidering things he had taken for granted when he thought about them in her company. She told him more about her years in Houston and Galveston, about the raw inequity she had seen there in a city that was building itself into something impressive on the backs of people who received very little credit for the building. She had taught children of all backgrounds in her early career, before the schools sorted themselves into the arrangements that money and prejudice required, and she had found that talent and intelligence were distributed by nature with considerable evenness, and very little respect for the social arrangements that tried to organize them otherwise. He told her about the early days of the ranch, about his father, who had been a hard man but a fair one, about the way the Texas range had been before the big fence building of the late 1870s began to divide it up, about the changes he had watched come, and the changes he expected to keep coming. He told her, one January evening with the north wind audible against the windows, about Caroline. Not the grief of it, not the shape of the absence, but the person herself, where she had come from, San Marcos, from a family of teachers, what she had been like, steady and funny and relentlessly optimistic, what the ranch had felt like when she was in it, what her laugh had sounded like, the plans she had made in the dark that she would never get to carry out. Belle listened to all of it with the full and careful attention she brought to everything that mattered. "She sounds like someone who would have been your equal in every way," she said when he had finished. "She was," he said. "She was exactly that." "I am glad you had that," Belle said. "I am sorry you lost it." He looked at her across the table. "I have been afraid," he said, "that caring about someone again would be a betrayal of what I had before. I know that is not rational." "It is not rational," she said gently, "but it is human." "How do you manage it?" he asked. "Allowing yourself to trust again after Galveston." She was quiet for a moment. "Slowly," she said, "and with evidence. I wait for evidence that the person I am considering trusting has shown me, in small, consistent ways, who they actually are. And then I trust what the evidence shows me." He let this settle. "What does the evidence show you?" he asked. "About here, about this." She looked at him steadily. "It shows me a man who runs his land honestly, who treats the people who work for him with respect, who grieves genuinely, who is uncomfortable with pretense, who says what he means, and who has been careful with me from the first day I arrived, not because he was managing me but because he was being what he actually is." He held her gaze. "Belle," he said. "I know," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, tentative, and she turned her hand and held it. And they sat like that in the warm kitchen while the wind went on talking against the windows. And it was the simplest and most significant thing that had happened in that house in 2 years. February was a different kind of month. There was a careful tenderness between them now that was acknowledged without being rushed. And the daily life of the ranch continued its patient practical round, while underneath it something was growing in the way that things grow in winter, slowly, toward the light. Decker had noticed, which meant he was uncharacteristically thoughtful in his movements around the main house, like a man who is trying not to startle birds. Hob had noticed before anyone, which was characteristic. One morning Hob came into the kitchen while Belle was making the bread dough and set a jar of honey on the table without comment. Belle looked at it, then at him. "It is good in the biscuits," he said, and went back outside. Belle stood at the kitchen counter and smiled at the jar of honey and then went back to the dough. And the bread that came out of the oven that evening was the best the house had produced. And Lewis ate 2 extra biscuits with considerable honey and did not remark on why they were better than usual. But he knew. In the middle of February, on a clear, cold afternoon that had the particular quality of a winter day that is not quite ready to admit that spring is coming but can feel it approaching, Lewis asked Belle to walk with him to the south fence of the home pasture, which was his particular favorite view of the ranch. The long roll of grass meeting the sky at a distance that seemed to go forever, and the windmill turning slow in the afternoon light, and the cattle moving in their patient dark shapes. They walked out through the gate and along the fence line without hurrying, and the cold air was clean and sharp, and the sky was that color again, the deep, impossible blue. "I want to ask you something," Lewis said. "Then ask it," she said. It was what she always said. "I am not a man who does things by half," he said, "and I am not asking you this because it is what is done or because of any expectation. I am asking you because I have thought about it carefully and I mean it completely." She was looking at the grass, and he could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful stillness of someone listening with their whole self. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as an employee. As my wife, if you would have me. I know I am a man with a history and a grief and a ranch that wants considerable work and a lantern I have not lit in 2 years. I am not offering you an uncomplicated life. I am offering you a real one with me in it for as long as God allows." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the wide land. "Lewis," she said, and her voice was careful and full. "I know it is soon," he said, "and I know you have reason to be careful. I am not asking for an immediate answer. I am simply asking so you know what I am saying." She turned to look at him, and her brown eyes were bright with something that was not tears but was adjacent to them, the kind of brightness that comes to eyes when something large is moving through the person behind them. "It is not too soon," she said. I have been in this house for 4 months, and I have learned more about who you are in those 4 months than I have known about most people in years. And what I know is this: you are a man I could build a life with, a real life. The kind I have wanted and not let myself want because wanting it seemed dangerous. She took a breath. Yes, she said, I will marry you. He had not been certain, despite everything, that she would say it, and hearing it produced in him a feeling that he had no name for, something between gratitude and joy, and the particular ache of a man who has been standing in the dark for a long time and sees the light come on. He took her hands, both of them, and held them, and she held his back, and they stood in the south pasture with the Panhandle sky enormous above them and the windmill turning and the cattle moving, and said nothing more for a while because nothing more needed to be said. When they came back through the gate and walked up toward the house, Lewis stopped on the porch. The main lantern hung beside the front door, its glass still clouded, its wick dry these 2 years. Belle stood beside him and looked at it, and she did not say anything, because she understood what she was looking at. He reached up and took the lantern down and took it inside. He cleaned the glass carefully at the kitchen sink while Belle watched. He trimmed the wick, which had gone brittle, and replaced it with new cord from the supply shelf. He filled the reservoir with fresh lamp oil from the can in the storeroom. He carried it back out to the porch and hung it on its hook. The afternoon was going to gold, the sky streaking with the long colors of a winter sunset, and the light was beginning to fail in the way it does on clear, cold days, quickly and beautifully. Lewis struck the match. The lantern caught, and the flame rose small and steady, and threw its warm circle of light across the porch boards, catching the grain of the wood and the edges of the railing and the dust motes that drifted in the still cold air. Belle stood beside him and watched it burn. "It is a good lantern," she said. "It is," he said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch while the light went down out of the sky and the lantern went on burning in the dark, steady and certain, and Hob came out of the bunkhouse and saw it from across the yard and stopped and looked at it for a long moment, and then he took his hat off and put it back on and went back inside. They were married in March, on a Saturday, at the Millhaven church with the bell that could be heard half a mile out. Reverend Calvert performed the service in front of what turned out to be a considerable portion of the town, because news in Millhaven traveled with the particular efficiency that small towns are capable of when the news is good. Mrs. Aldrich was in the front row in her good Sunday hat. Decker had washed and pressed his shirt and stood at Lewis's shoulder with the careful solemnity of a man who has been asked to perform a serious function and intends to perform it correctly. Hob sat in the second row and looked at the altar with an expression that was the closest thing to pure satisfaction that a 63-year-old man of his nature was going to publicly demonstrate. Belle wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from the San Antonio dressmaker through the general store, a deep green that did something particular to her eyes. She walked to the front of the church with the straightforward, unhurried calm of someone who is walking towards something they have chosen fully and without reservation. Lewis stood at the front of the church and watched her come and felt the full, complicated weight of the moment. Grief for what he had lost, gratitude for what he had found, love that was new and real and entirely its own thing, not a replacement for the past, but an addition to the story of who he was. He said his vows clearly and meant every word, and she said hers clearly and meant every word, and Reverend Calvert pronounced them married under the Texas sky, with the church bell making its announcement to the half-mile of country around them. Spring came to the Rhodes ranch with an energy that seemed to Lewis to be personal. The grass came back green and fast, the stock tank filled to its highest level in 3 years from the March rains, the cattle were in excellent condition, and the calf crop was strong. Decker was reading, not with full fluency yet but with increasing confidence, and had taken to keeping a daily log of the cattle counts in his own hand, which he showed to Belle each evening with the particular pride of someone who has gained a new capacity. Belle planted the garden. She had talked to Lewis about it first, in February, asking him quietly whether it was something he would mind her doing. He had looked at her with the direct openness that was how he looked at things he felt strongly about. Caroline would have wanted it planted, he said. That is the truth of it. She would have been the first one out there with a shovel. Then I will plant it in a way that honors what she would have wanted, Belle said. He nodded, and the matter was settled. She turned the earth herself on the warm days of early March, breaking up the 2 years of dried weeds and working the soil until it was dark and loose and ready. She planted potatoes and onions and carrots and squash and beans. She planted herbs along the south edge, thyme, sage, rosemary. She planted flowers along the north fence of the garden plot, not impractical ones, but hardy things that would come back year after year without requiring excessive attention and would make the kitchen smell like something other than just a kitchen. Lewis came and stood at the garden fence one afternoon and watched her on her knees in the soil, her hair pinned up and her sleeves rolled, working with the focused pleasure of someone doing exactly what they are built for. "You look like you have been gardening all your life," he said. "My mother had a garden," she said, sitting back on her heels and looking up at him. "In Houston, she could make anything grow." "Like daughter, like mother," he said. She smiled at him, full and warm, and turned back to the earth. By April, the first shoots were coming up, small and green and astonishing in the way that things coming out of the ground always are. Belle would go out in the mornings with her coffee and crouch down and look at them, and Lewis would watch her from the kitchen window and feel the slow, full contentment of a man whose life has found its shape again. In May, Belle told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening. Simply, the way she told him most important things, directly and without preamble. He was at the table with the week's supply list and she sat down across from him and said, "I went to see Dr. Harmon today. We are going to have a baby." Lewis put down the supply list and looked at her. His first feeling was something enormous and warm that he could not immediately name. His second feeling was a tenderness so intense it was almost painful. His third feeling was a profound gratitude that was directed simultaneously at Belle and at the universe in general for the improbable gift of a second chance. "Belle," he said, and his voice was low and full. "I know," she said, and she was smiling and her eyes were bright. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in both of his and looked up at her with everything he was feeling plain on his face, which was not a usual condition for him. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Dr. Harmon says everything looks fine. December, he thinks." He pressed his forehead against her hands for a moment and she held him there. "I am glad," he said. "I am so glad." Hob found out the next morning when Belle appeared at breakfast with a particular quality of settled happiness that he read accurately and immediately. He said nothing, but he made an unusually elaborate breakfast. Eggs fried the way Belle liked, fresh biscuits, a pot of good coffee, and the honey on the table. Decker found out when Lewis told him directly, because Decker was the kind of man who would be hurt to find out second. "That is the best news I have heard in a considerable time," Decker said, and shook Lewis's hand with a grip that expressed the full measure of his sincerity. The summer of 1883 on the Rhodes Ranch was the best summer Lewis could remember in many years. The cattle operation was at its most organized and profitable, the records immaculate under Belle's management. The garden produced in abundance, the potatoes and onions coming in fat and plentiful, the squash enormous, the beans filling basket after basket. Belle put up preserves in the evenings with the efficiency of someone who has been looking forward to this particular activity for some time, and the shelves in the storeroom filled up with jars that glowed amber and green in the lamplight. Lewis repaired the library room that had been sitting half-finished since Caroline had first planned it, finishing the shelves himself on the long summer evenings while the light lasted. Belle had, over the months, accumulated a small collection of books from the general store, from Mrs. Aldrich when she was done with them, and from a traveling book merchant who came through Millhaven once a season. These went onto the shelves in an arrangement that was Belle's work and was satisfying to look at. She also took on, in the summer months, a small matter of quiet significance. 2 Mexican children from the family that had taken up a homestead claim 3 miles west, a girl of 8 named Rosa and her brother, 6-year-old Tomas, were not attending the Millhaven school because the school was 3 miles the other direction, and their father could not afford to take them in the wagon. Belle began teaching them on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she taught Decker his letters, and in the way of good teachers, she made it feel like a thing worth doing on both sides of the lesson. Their mother, Maria Reyes, came with them and sometimes sat at the table and watched, and Belle noticed after a few weeks that Maria was following along, and she began to include her without making a formal announcement of it. Lewis came home one Thursday afternoon to find his kitchen occupied by the Reyes family and his wife at the table with a primer and 3 eager students of varying ages. And he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and felt his heart do something large and uncomplicated. He was quiet about it, but that evening after the Reyes family had walked back to their homestead in the golden late afternoon light, he found Belle in the kitchen cleaning up, and he put his hands on her shoulders from behind and leaned down and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am a teacher," she said. "It is what I do." The Panhandle summer was hot and long, and the work of it was endless, but it had a quality that Lewis had almost forgotten was possible, which was that it felt like living rather than enduring. He and Belle fell into the patterns of a married life with a naturalness that he thought might have been luck but gradually understood was something they had both been building intentionally daily, in the small and consistent ways that Belle said she watched for evidence. He learned that she had a temper. Not a vicious one, not a destructive one, but a real one, the kind that comes with genuine convictions. She came home from town one August afternoon, having witnessed a scene at the general store that involved Caldwell treating a Comanche man who had come to trade with a contemptuous rudeness that she found intolerable, and she was sharp-voiced about it for the rest of the afternoon, and delivered an articulate opinion about the ongoing injustices inflicted on the native peoples of this territory that was coherent, historically grounded, and difficult to argue with. Lewis did not argue with it. He agreed with most of it, and the parts he had not fully considered she had now made him consider. He went back to town the next day and had a separate conversation with Caldwell that was not as articulate as Belle's, but was clearer in certain physical ways that Caldwell seemed to find equally persuasive. He did not tell Belle about this conversation, but she seemed to know, because she gave him a look at supper that was both approving and very slightly amused, and passed him the biscuits with a little more deliberateness than was strictly necessary. He loved her. He loved her in the way that comes with genuine knowledge of a person, not the way of early romance that is in love with possibility, but the real way, the way that has survived actual contact with who someone is in their ordinary moments and loves them more for it rather than less. She loved him. She had come to this piece of it slowly and with evidence, as she had said she would, and what the evidence had shown her was a man who was exactly what he appeared to be. Solid and honest and quiet in the way of deep water, capable of being moved by things that mattered, careful of the people in his care, and genuinely changed by the presence of someone who was genuinely present with him. October came again, marking a year since Belle had arrived at the boarding house with her trunk and her clear brown eyes and her no-nonsense handshake. Lewis noticed the anniversary without saying anything about it for several days, and then said something about it on a quiet evening when they were sitting on the porch with the first real cold of autumn coming down. "A year ago today," he said. She looked up from the shawl she was knitting, her belly round and visible now in the lamplight from the doorway. "Give or take a few days," she said. "Approximately," he said. She looked at him. "Are you glad?" He turned to look at her with the full directness that he had gradually learned to give his best feelings when they deserved it. "Yes," he said, "more than I know how to say." She looked at the main lantern burning by the door, steady and warm in the October evening, and then back at him. "It has been burning since before dark," she said, "for nearly a year now." "It has," he said, "and it will go on burning." She reached over and put her hand in his, and he held it, and the Panhandle dark came on around them with all its stars, and the ranch was quiet and present and theirs, and the lantern threw its steady circle of light across the porch boards as if it had never been dark at all. Their son was born on the 14th of December, 1883, which the Millhaven Gazette later noted was the coldest night of the year up to that point. Dr. Harmon attended, and Hob kept the kitchen stove burning so hot that the house was warm throughout, and Decker walked back and forth across the yard in the freezing dark for 3 hours because he was not able to sit still, and the cold air was preferable to the inside of the bunkhouse where waiting felt more like waiting. Belle was stronger than most women. Dr. Harmon had attended in 20 years of frontier medicine, which he said to Lewis afterward with the tone of a man making a professional assessment, and the baby arrived with the robust protest of a person who has opinions about his entrance into the world and intends to register them. Lewis held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the bedroom in his arms, and the boy looked at him with the dark, unfocused eyes of the very newborn, and Lewis felt the full, staggering weight of the moment, which was both entirely new and continuous with everything that had come before it. The grief and the love and the long dark and the light returning, all of it part of the same life, all of it held in the same heart. Belle watched him from the pillow, tired and present and radiant in the particular way of women who have just done the hardest thing a person can do. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. They had discussed names, but had not settled, in the way of people who are not sure until they see the person who the name is for. "John," Lewis said, after a moment. "John Henry Rhodes. John for his father, Henry for Caroline's father, because it seemed right to Lewis that this new life should carry forward something from the life that had come before it, not as replacement but as continuity, the way a river carries everything that has flowed into it." Belle looked at him with the clear understanding that she always had of what he meant by things. "John Henry Rhodes," she said. "Yes, that is right." Hob came inside from the cold and was told and stood at the bedroom doorway holding his hat and looking at the baby in Lewis's arms with an expression that was pure and uncomplicated, and that Lewis saved carefully in his memory. Decker was told and came inside with ice-stiffened hands and a face that was doing several things at once, and managed to produce a smile that was the realest thing he had done in considerable time. The winter months were full and exhausting, and complete in the way that a household with a new baby in winter tends to be. John Henry was a good baby, as babies go, which is to say he slept more than he didn't and ate with the commitment of someone who has made a serious decision about living. He was dark-eyed like Belle and had the Rhodes jaw, which Lewis claimed with a pride he tried to make sound modest and failed. By spring, John Henry was 3 months old and the ranch was waking up and the garden needed to be turned again, and Belle was back at the desk doing the books 3 weeks after the birth in a way that Dr. Harmon found both medically impressive and personally unsurprising for someone of her constitution. The Tuesday and Thursday lessons resumed in April. Rosa Reyes could now read almost fluently and had a particular gift for arithmetic that Belle was encouraging with great pleasure. Tomas was catching up. Maria Reyes, who had come to the lessons as a silent observer, was now reading at a confident level and had begun keeping the accounts for her husband's homestead, which had the effect of organizing his record-keeping for the first time and making the homestead's operation considerably more efficient, which Hector Reyes acknowledged to Lewis with a gratitude that went somewhat beyond the ordinary. The Panhandle of 1884 was a busy and complicated place. The cattle trade was in full force, the railroad was extending its reach, And the fencing of the open range was creating conflicts between the large operations and the smaller homesteaders that would grow significantly worse before they got better. Lewis was a fair man in his dealings with the smaller operations around him, keeping his fences where they belonged and his cattle off the homesteaders' land. And he had a reputation in the county for honesty in the cattle trade that made his operation one of the more respected ones in the region. Belle had taken on, quietly and without fanfare, a small but significant presence in Millhaven's community life. She was not a woman who sought public roles, but she was a woman who saw things that needed doing and did them, and the things she did tended to accumulate into a visible pattern. The informal school in her kitchen had resulted, by the summer of 1884, in 3 more families sending their children, and by the following year there was a real conversation in town about whether Millhaven needed a second school or an expansion of the first, and Belle's name was in that conversation in a way she neither sought nor avoided. She was happy. This was the fact that Lewis returned to most often in the quiet inventory he kept of the things that mattered. Not just functional, not just making do, but genuinely, rootedly happy, the way someone is happy when they are in exactly the life they are built for, doing exactly the work that is theirs to do with people around them who are real and present and valued. He was happy too. It was a different happiness than what he had before, not better or worse but its own complete thing, shaped by everything that had happened and carrying all of it, the light and the dark alike. He thought of Caroline often, not with the sharp grief of the early years but with a warm and grateful remembrance, the way you remember someone who mattered and always will. He thought she would have liked Belle, which was not a small thing to think, and he thought it with the ease of a man who has made peace with the full complexity of his own heart. He kept the lantern lit. Every evening before dark, he would go to the front door and take the lantern down and check the oil and hang it back and light it when the sky began to fail. It was not a conscious ceremony, and it was not a performance. It was simply what he did, the way he had always done it, the habit reclaimed and made new by everything that had come after. 2 years after John Henry was born in December of 1885, their second child arrived, a daughter, small and fierce and absolutely certain of herself from the first moment. They named her Clara Mee, and from the beginning she had her mother's eyes and her father's determination, and a voice that Decker claimed could be heard in the north pasture, which was probably an exaggeration but not a large one. The Rhodes household was full. It was warm and full and ongoing in the way that good things are ongoing, with the ordinary fabric of it made up of small, true moments. John Henry on the porch watching the cattle come in with wide, dark eyes. Clara Mee learning to pull herself upright on the kitchen table at 9 months with a look of absolute triumph. Belle at the garden in the early morning with her coffee. Hob teaching John Henry the names of the horses before the boy could properly talk. Decker reading to himself in the bunkhouse in the evenings by his own lamp, which Lewis found deeply satisfying every time he happened to notice it. The main house lantern burned every night. In the spring of 1886, a traveling writer from an eastern newspaper came through Millhaven doing a series of pieces on the Texas cattle country, and he noticed the lantern burning on the Rhodes porch in the early evening and asked someone about it. The someone was Mrs. Aldrich, who told him the story with the economy and precision of a woman who knows a good story when she has been living adjacent to one. The writer came out to the ranch and asked Lewis if he could write about it. Lewis considered this for a moment, looking at the man with his notebook and his city clothes and his genuine interest. "It is a private thing," Lewis said. "Most true things are," the writer said. Lewis thought about this. He looked at the porch, at the lantern hanging in the afternoon light, at Belle coming across the yard from the garden with John Henry on her hip and Clara Mee toddling beside her, and at the whole completed shape of a life that had seemed, 2 years into its darkest stretch, like it might never find its light again. "You can write that the lantern is lit," Lewis said. "That is the whole story." The writer nodded and wrote it down, and it appeared in his piece as a single line at the end, which was enough. Hobbs' eyes continued to give him trouble through 1886, and Lewis hired a young hand named Pete Vargas to help with the fence riding and the cattle work, a 20-year-old from the Mexican border country who was quick with a rope and honest in his work, and was brought into the fold of the ranch with the same easy directness that characterized everything on the Rhodes spread. He began attending the kitchen lessons within 2 months of his arrival, sitting beside Rosa Reyes's younger brother at the table, while Belle went through the primer with the patience and pleasure of someone who is doing exactly what they love. Lewis watched the ranch expand and change and continue, and he understood that this was what a life was. Not a fixed thing but a growing one, taking in new people and new circumstances, and being shaped by them while remaining essentially what it had always been at the center, which was a piece of ground where honest people did honest work and cared for what was theirs. In the autumn of 1886, 4 years after Belle Bristol had come to the Millhaven boarding house with her trunk and her clean handwriting and her direct brown eyes, Lewis stood on the porch of his house in the late afternoon, with the first cold of October coming down, and felt the extraordinary ordinariness of his own life, with a depth of appreciation that only comes to people who have known what it is to be without it. The cattle were in the south pasture. The garden had been put to bed for winter, the soil turned and covered. The books were current to the day, the supply inventory complete, the winter provisions stocked and organized. Hob was in the kitchen making something that smelled like the beginning of a very long good supper. Decker was coming in from the north fence line on his horse in the golden late light, and Pete was bringing in the last of the cattle behind him. John Henry was 3 years old and running across the yard toward Decker's horse with the purposeful fearlessness of a child who has been raised near large animals and therefore does not properly fear them. Clara Mee was 1 year old and sitting on a blanket on the porch in the last of the afternoon warmth, watching her brother run and making comments about it in the particular private language of the very young. Belle came through the front door and stood beside Lewis and looked at all of it. She had a small flower handprint on her calico sleeve from the biscuit dough that was currently waiting in the kitchen, and her hair had come down on one side in the way it did when she had been moving quickly, and she was exactly as she had been when she arrived and also entirely different, which is what love does to people when it is real. Lewis reached up and took the lantern down from its hook. He cleaned the glass, checked the oil, trimmed the wick and rehung it, and then he took a match from his pocket and waited for the light to go. The sun went down behind the western flat in long colors, orange and rose and the deep edge of purple, and the sky above it went the particular blue of a clear Texas October evening, darkening toward the east where the stars were already beginning to appear. Lewis struck the match. The lantern caught. Warm and steady, it threw its circle of light across the porch boards in the front of the house and touched the edge of the yard, where John Henry was now sitting on Decker's boot while Decker walked, which was a game they had invented together, and which both of them found highly satisfactory. It caught Clara Mee's attention on her blanket, and she turned to look at it with the wide-eyed gravity of a child looking at light. Belle put her head against Lewis's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch under the lit lantern and watched the Panhandle evening come on around their life, full and real and full of people, the cattle settling in the south pasture and the windmill turning, and the supper starting to smell like exactly the right thing on a cold October evening. "Thank you," Lewis said into her hair. "For what?" she said. "For coming," he said. "For staying." She put her arm around his waist and held on and said nothing, because it was the kind of moment that has already said everything. The lantern burned, steady and sure, through the deepening dark, its light visible from the road and from the pasture and from the bunkhouse window where Hob was going to bed early, as he had taken to doing, and from the middle of the south pasture where a lone calf was learning the dark for the first time and looking, by instinct, for the nearest light to move toward. It was lit and it would stay lit. That was the whole story, and it was enough, and it was everything.